much. It's really wonderful to be with all of you this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. And it's particularly a lovely time of year to be exploring the Haftarah because, as I'll talk about a little bit later, we are entering a period. Well, we've been in a period for a couple of weeks now, but we are really entering a period of the calendrical cycle, in which we are going to be reading very specific Haftarot. So we'll talk about why, but I want to get us started actually by inviting folks to put into the chat one word or short phrase. When you think of the term the Haftarah, what comes to mind for you? We'll take a minute now and we'll just put that into the chat. What comes to mind for you when you think about the Haftarah? Um, Thank you everyone for your comments into the chat. And to get us started by giving a little bit of a history of what the Haftarah is. So the word Haftarah comes from the Hebrew root meaning to close or depart. The Haftarah is read following the Torah reading on Shabbat mornings. In addition, a Haftarah is read on the festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and on the Yamim HaNoraim, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And the Haftarah is read on the afternoons of all public fast days, including Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av, as well as all of the minor fasts. So as we are learning today, Tisha B'Av was a couple of days ago. And so there is a Haftarah read on the fast day in the afternoon. And so the origins of the Haftarah, the custom of reading a Haftarah are unknown, but several theories have been suggested or offered. And I will name that the theories that have been suggested or offered that I have thus far discovered, we don't have historicity for any of them, but they each have their own really unique possibilities associated. So one suggests that the Haftarot were read in response to the theological disputes between the Jewish community and the Samaritans, who do not accept the canonicity of any books of the Tanakh beyond the book of Joshua. So just to put that another way, there's an idea that the reason we read Haftarot, and we'll look at this when we look at the brachot for the Haftarot, the blessings for the Haftarot a little bit later on, but the first blessing before we read the Haftarah talks about God choosing good prophets. And so some people have the theory that the reason that we make that bracha on the Haftarah is to say that our prophets are true and good, as opposed to what the Samaritans are an offshoot. They are their own group now. There are communities of the Samaritans in the land of Israel today. They originally, I believe, were an offshoot of the Northern Kingdom, and they accept the canonicity of the Hebrew Bible only through the book of Joshua. So the only books that they accept of the Tanakh are the Torah, the first 5 books, and the book of Joshua. And so this might have been a response to the Samaritans. A second theory, widely taught, but without historical support. So I imagine that a lot of us were taught this idea, is that the practice was instituted in 168 before the Common Era, just before the Maccabean revolt, when reading the Torah was forbidden by Antiochus. That might have been a reason for this practice, but we don't have any historical proof for that. And a third theory suggests that the Torah were read after a synagogue or community's Torahs were destroyed. So there's an idea, and again, I don't know how much support this has, but the idea that the Haftarot were read in response to the fact that there was a community that had its Torah scrolls destroyed. Though the precise origin has been lost to history, the practice is noted in the Christian New Testament as well. So there are references in the Christian scriptures to this practice, or to the practice of reading the Haftarot in shul, in the synagogue. And unlike the annual or triennial, so annual meaning the yearly and triennial meaning the 3-year Torah reading cycle, um, which is a fixed cycle, Torah vary between and within communities. So there are differences in Haftarot between Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, Yemenite, Mizrahim, and even within all of the different subgroups of the Jewish people, there are different Haftarot that are selected. And even though there are these differences between and amongst the Jewish community around which Haftarot are read at which times, the differences are often quite minute, but they're still there. Typically, there is a link between the Haftarah for a given Shabbat and the Torah portion. That link can often be small, abstract, or tenuous. So usually during the year, often I should say, there is a link of some variety between the Haftarah, the portion from the Nevi'im, the prophets, which is the second portion of Tanakh, and the Torah portion. An example of that is that on Shabbat B'Shalach, when we read the song at the sea, the song of freedom that the Israelites sang when we crossed the sea, our Haftarah for that Shabbat is the song of Devorah. There is a link between the freedom that we are celebrating in the Song of the Sea in Exodus and the song that Devorah sings in the book of Judges. That's one fairly obvious link. And another fairly obvious link is that when we read about, I believe when we are reading the final portion of Bereshit, of Vayichi, which is when Yaakov Avinu dies, when Jacob dies, we read about King David dying. There again, there's a linkage. Another idea that I have heard is that the Torah are meant to be what's known as an intertext or a commentary on the Torah portion. Sure, how much there is behind that idea that the Haftarah is like a commentary, a rabbinic commentary on the Torah portion. That may have worked for Jews of a very particular kind of rabbinic disposition, but I think for a lot of us today, that kind of got lost. But I will also say that at other times of the year, like right now, for example, the Haftarah is thematically linked to a period of time on the Jewish calendar. So right now, we are about to enter the 5 weeks, the 7 weeks of consolation. We are about to read 7 Haftarot from the book of Yeshayahu, from the book of Isaiah. We actually already read last week a Haftarah from the book of Yeshayahu, which was read for Shabbat Chazon, because Shabbat Chazon is the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, and now we are after Tisha B'Av, so we are moving into what is known as Shabbat Nachamu, and the Haftarah, which is beginning in Isaiah 40, begins with Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, comfort, comfort my people. And the link there is that the Haftarah is connected to our calendar. It is not connected to our Torah portion of the Et Hanan. So now we are at a time when the Haftarot are about something else, not about the Torah reading. I would, though, to start by thinking about the blessings that we say. In the synagogue service, there are, as many of you may know, before the Torah reading, we have a Torah service. Before the actual Torah is read, each person who gets an aliyah to the Torah is honored with making the blessings, makes a blessing before the Torah reading, and makes a blessing after the Torah reading. And both those blessings have to do with our gratitude for being given Torah as a people. The Haftarot have extremely extensive blessings, and one of the after the Haftarah, the first blessing before the Haftarah is less extensive, but after it's considerably more. I want to invite us to look at the blessing before the Haftarah. So I want to invite, we're only going to look at the blessing before the Haftarah. We are not going to look at the blessings after right now. I want to invite anyone who would like to read the English, please, to unmute and make sure you are queued up to do so. But if you are interested in reading it, please raise your Zoom hand and we will call on you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Rabbi. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who chose good prophets and was pleased with their words, which were spoken in truth. Blessed are you, Adonai, who chooses the Torah and Moses, his servant in Israel, his people, and the prophets of truth and righteousness.
Beautiful reading, Paul. Thank you so much. So in that blessing, we have a pretty strong theological statement, right? We have the blessing that the person who is reading the Haftarah makes this blessing traditionally. And they're basically saying, thank you, Hashem. Thank you, God, for giving us good prophets, prophets who spoke words of truth and spoke in truth. And thank you for establishing this covenant with Moshe, with Moses, and with the Jewish people. So the rabbis here are making a point that that there are prophets that are speaking truthfully, and that what we are about to read is from a quote true prophet. Now, we have to bear in mind that there is an idea of the false prophet. We're going to read about that a little bit later on, actually, in our Torah cycle, in the book of Deuteronomy. But there's a notion of false and true prophets, and there have always been, theological disputations and offshoots, and of course, we know Christianity became its own thing over time, but it was originally a tiny branch of the Jewish community before it branched out into its own completely different religion. And you had the same thing with the Samaritans, and you have the same thing with a lot of other groups of people that kind of branch off and do their own thing. And so the rabbis are making a claim here that this Tanakh, that these prophets are part of our tradition, they are good and true, and that we're going to learn from them and we're going to read their words. And that's a really interesting thing, because I think for a lot of us today, reading the Haftarah, we aren't really thinking in those terms at all. It's more like, okay, so we read the Torah portion and then we read the portion of the prophets. And I hear over and over again after shul on Saturday morning, I'll talk to friends at Kiddush, and without fail, over and over and over again, what I get is, I don't understand the Haftarah. Why is this here? Most of us step out for a break at that point. I don't understand how it connects to the Torah reading. What's the point of all of this? And so if we think as early rabbinic Jews did, I think part of the point not only might have been to actually familiarize people with the prophets as a whole, but also I think to make a theological claim that this is true and righteous and good. These Haftarah, now not every Haftarah is pleasant to read. There are plenty of very difficult ones, but the prophets themselves are speaking words of truth. And so that is its own theological claim that is being really expressed in terms of where we are as a Jewish community vis-a-vis other communities. So that feels important to know historically speaking. And I think for us as folks today, it's a little bit less compelling from well, why am I doing this in shul type of a thing. So I actually want to invite us now to look a little bit at Talmud. And I'm just going to quickly paraphrase. We're going to look at source 1. I'm going to go ahead and read the Gemara. Now, bear in mind that we are using the Steinsaltz translation, so there are interpolations within the translation, and I'm going to go ahead and read it as presented, but just know that there are interpolations there. We're starting with source 1, and I'm going to go ahead and read this, and then I will invite a reader for the next source. But this is just kind of grounding us in where the Haftarah shows up in the Talmud. And just to contextualize, we're looking at a piece of Megillah 31a. I have excerpted this. There are pieces of this that I took out because they were not directly relevant to what we are discussing. But we are in a conversation right now where the rabbis are establishing the Torah reading cycle. The Tractate of Megillah is part of the Seder Moed, the section of Talmud that focuses on the holidays and appointed days. And Megillah, as you might imagine or infer from the name, is actually initially about Purim. When do you read Megillat Esther? There's a whole discussion in that tractate about that. And because they are connected, and it often happens in Talmud, the rabbis start in one location and go another location. So they talk about the Megillah and they talk about when do you read it and how do you read it and what are the laws of reading the Megillah. And then they're like, we're talking about the laws of reading Megillah. What are the laws of reading the Torah and which Torah portions do you read at which particular times? And that's what they are addressing now. So I'm going to go ahead and read and explain this source, and then I will invite some comments into the chat, some questions into the chat, and we'll go from there. We are on source 1 of the source sheet, and I am going to read in English. The sages taught in a Baraita, which is in a piece of text that is from the same time as the Mishnah, which is what the Gemara is commenting on, but it was not included in the Mishnah. On the first day of Pesach, the congregation reads the portion of the festivals from Leviticus 22:26, 23:44, and they read the Haftarah, the account of the Passover celebrated at Gilgal from Joshua. The Gemara comments, and this is interesting because now that is the Baraita, what I just read. Now the Gemara is going to comment. And nowadays, so in the time of Bavel, in the diaspora, where there are 2 festival days. So at the time of the Gemara's comment here, there were 2 festival days in the diaspora, keeping the festivals for 2 days, which many of us in the diaspora still do. 2 days of Passover. On the first day, they read as the Haftarah the account of the Passover celebrated at Gilgal, and on the second day, they read from the account of the Passover observed by Josiah in 2 Kings 23. So what's really interesting here is that what's happening in the Talmud is that we are being told that there is this Haftarah, this ending of the Torah service by reading from the prophets, and we're being told that that differs from one community to the next. And it's still the case that in communities outside of Israel that keep 2 days of the festival, we do additional readings that are not done in those communities that only keep 1 day in Israel itself, as well as outside of Israel. And so this Baraita, this piece of Talmud continues. We're not going to go through it inside because it's the same kind of thematic idea here. Basically, what the rabbis are doing is they are writing down, they are recording for our benefit what the readings are going to be on different days as an established practice. Because bear in mind, they were at a new era. I think many of us feel that we are as well. They are at a new era of Judaism where the locus was gone. The temple was destroyed. We again just observed that commemoration 2 days ago. And over a several 100-year period, they're trying to figure out how do we keep this thing going. And so part of what that means is to establish these different readings as a way of keeping people connected. And that's what is happening in this section of Talmud. They are just simply going through very extensively which Haftarot are read at different times. And that is largely intact today. And so if you're really interested in like reading through, what do we read on all the different holidays from the Talmud, that is available for you if you would like to look at that on your own. For the purposes of our lecture today, our class today, I'm going to just use that first piece as an example, but it will continue onward for quite a while, outlining all of the different Torah readings and Haftarot. Specifically, I want you to focus on the Haftarot that are chosen. And there's no explanation. It's interesting. It's just like, on this day, you read this Torah portion and you read this Haftarah portion. And on this other day, you read this Torah portion and this Haftarah portion. So I think that that's why the lack of definitive historicity of why it's done is there because we don't really know why. We don't know exactly where this arose, but it is a standard part of most communities. And I would actually argue that it's a really important part of the synagogue service. And I'm going to invite us, we're going to look again at one more source from Talmud, and then actually I'm going to invite us to shift into a conversation sort of about what we do now. And I'm going to go ahead and read this as well. It's source 2, ET 60a. You are welcome to read along as well. And I'm going to, this is a different topic. So the question arises, do you read the Haftarah? There are extensive laws and guidelines about how the Torah is read, which is not what we are discussing today. So folks who may have questions about that, and there are lots of them to be had, that is not the topic for our class today, but it is a really important area to address. I am mentioning it simply by way of context. There are many different particular laws around how the Torah is read and how the Torah is written and what you can read the Torah from. That is the context that we are going to be using to look at this piece of Talmud. And so we're gonna have a discussion about what can you actually read the Haftarah from? And I will elucidate as we go on. So I'm going to start reading source 2, Gittin 60a. And Rabban and Rav Yosef both say, it is prohibited to publicly read the Haftarah, the portion from the prophets, that is read after, the weekly Torah portion on Shabbat from a scroll containing only the Haftarot. What is the reason for this? It is because the type of scroll may not be written with the words of the prophets, as the words of the prophets must also be written as complete books. Okay, so what's happening here? The Torah, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara and the Talmud about, is it kosher to have a Torah scroll that only contains one of the 5 books of the Torah? And the rabbis say it is not. Even if that book is complete, let's say I had a scroll that had Sefer Bereshit on it, the book of Genesis, is that kosher? Can I learn from that? Is that a kosher scroll? And the rabbis say no, even though it's a complete book. And so too, Rabbah and Rav Yosef are saying here that when we write the books of Tanakh, we have to do so in a complete way. The Haftarot, if anybody who's been in synagogue and has seen them, they are often, excerpts from different chapters. And again, chapter and verse division is actually not originally a Jewish thing. It was actually originally done by Christian monks as a very easy tool for cross-referencing. We adopted it into our tradition, but it was not originally there. So when we reference parts of the prophets, we're doing so knowing that that passage is from a larger book. So it is absolutely true that today people read, this is true for me, I read the Haftarot out of a book that has only Haftarot in it, but it's not a scroll, it's kind of like, it's just a book of Haftarot. What Rav Yosef and Rabbah are saying is you can't write a scroll like a Torah scroll that only has the Haftarot on it, because the Haftarot have to be written as complete books. So that's a really interesting thing because there are communities that do have Haftarah scrolls. And so it's interesting that that has shifted over time. Given you all a lot of historical information, I'm going to pause now and I'm going to invite folks into the chat to write any reflections. And I'm then going to turn it over and we'll have some of those read aloud. Excuse me.
Thanks so much to everyone who's writing in your questions. And we'll give people a minute and I'll see if there's any most asked questions. Okay. Some people had some comments related to something you were saying, and now that it's out of context, I'm a little lost. But Bob asks, do we read the same Haftarah every Rosh Chodesh, and is there a relationship between what we read for Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month, and the book of the prophets that we select?
I love that question. Thank you for asking. When Rosh Chodesh, when the beginning of the month falls on a weekday, we do not read a Haftarah. It's really interesting. You think we might, but we actually don't. When Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, we do read a Haftarah for Rosh Chodesh. I believe it's the last chapter of Isaiah. I might be wrong about that. I believe it's the last chapter of Isaiah. Um, there is also a particular Haftarah that is read, like sometimes Rosh Chodesh will be on a Sunday, but you'll have this. Forgive me, we're going to nerd out for a second. The Jewish calendar has months that are either 29 or 30 days long. We are in a month right now that has 30 days, which means that the last 2 days of the month of Av, the last day of the month of Av and the first day of the month of Elul are both considered Rosh Chodesh. Whenever you have a month that has 30 days, the final day is considered the Rosh Chodesh for the next month. You could have a month that has 29 days, and in which case that is a complete month, and the first day of the following month is a one-day Rosh Chodesh. So in a very rare incident, when you have a Shabbat, and then the Shabbat is the 29th, and Sunday is the 1st, there is a particular Haftarah that is read when the next day is Rosh Chodesh. We do not have a Haftarah that is read on Rosh Chodesh on weekdays. We only have a Haftarah that is read on Rosh Chodesh when it is Shabbat.
Thank you. So when we read the Torah portion every Shabbat, we're not skipping verses from one week to the next. But there's a lot of the prophets that we don't actually cover through our reading of the Haftarah. And this is Stan's question. How can we think about skipping verses and skipping thoughts of what the prophet says?
Yeah, I love that question. It's one that I've actually spent a lot of time contemplating myself, because you're right. When we read the Torah, we don't skip verses. We go, week to week to week, right? And there are numerous Haftarot where actually the Haftarah starts in one chapter, and then we read a couple verses here, and then we skip to a couple verses over there. And it's a question that I'm sitting with. And I think it has to do with the different customs of the communities. And I think also because the Nevi'im, the prophets, the second section of Tanakh, where all the Haftarot come from, it is deep, it is definitely holy. It's part of Tanakh, it's holy. It's not on the same level of holiness as Torah. And I think there may just be a little bit more flexibility about what is the message that you want to convey in the passage. Often Haftarot end on a positive note, so that's also part of it. But I think it's a really good question, and I think it has to do just with how the custom developed over time.
Thank you. So I don't know actually how modern or ancient this custom is, but for a B'nai Mitzvah to read the Haftarah, is that something that has been sort of codified as part of the ritual of going up to the Torah, or is that something that has more modern implications?
As far as I understand to this point, that is a very modern ritual, but it's become codified. right? Like the ways in which a lot of ritual becomes codified over time is like a community does it. It's kind of like what it says in the Gemara. It says, go out and see what the people are doing, right? And so we create ritual all of the time, regardless of how far back it goes. And so the B'nai Mitzvah reading the Haftarah, I believe, is part of that simultaneous modern ritual innovation and modern ritual codification. It's basically become standard in many communities that I am familiar with for a person becoming B'nai Mitzvah, bar bat bi mitzvah, to read the Haftarah. And it's a curious custom. I don't know where it derives. It's really interesting because the Haftarah, and I should have said this earlier, I apologize, I didn't. Um, the Haftarah has a very particular trope to it as well that's distinctive from Torah trope. Although across different traditions, you know, the trope that we use, trope is a Yiddish term, by the way, something I just recently learned, didn't realize that until very recently. The trope that we use is different from one community to the next. And I believe that it's also true of Haftarah trope as well, but it is very different than Torah trope. Sure, I don't quite know where that derived from as a custom, but it's very much a live custom at this point.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we had a few questions about trope. Let's see. Are there communities or are there any movements in which reading all of the prophets in their entirety is a custom?
I am not aware of that as a liturgical custom in the context of synagogue service. But I do know that if anyone's familiar with the 929 project, for example, there's a project of reading one chapter of Tanakh every day, and it takes 3 years to learn. That is a personal learning schedule. I am not aware, and if anybody does know, please put it into the chat. I am personally not aware of customs of reading the prophets in their entirety as part of a liturgical practice. I think it could actually be very interesting. It'd be a lot of reading. The prophets are very extensive. I have learned most of it, actually. And there's a lot in there. There's a lot of history in there. There's a lot of prophecy in there. There's a lot of poetry. A lot of it is actually quite confounding and requiring a lot of commentary, particularly, I will say, for the book of Ezekiel. That gets really very intricate and complicated. The book of Isaiah also is beautiful and something to really learn, especially this time of year, because we're going to be journeying with the book of Isaiah until the end of the year. But yeah, I am not aware of any particular community that has the custom of reading the prophets in their entirety. I think it can be very interesting. We do, as a Haftarah for Yom Kippur, we do read the full book of Jonah, and there is I don't remember the parsha off the top of my head. I, for some reason, want to say it's Vayishlach, but I could be wrong about that. There's a parsha in Genesis where the Haftarah is the entirety of the book of Ovadia, but the book of Ovadia is one chapter. It's like 21 verses. So there are like, those are the two instances when I can think of we read the entire book as the Haftarah, but both of those cases, the books of the prophets that we are reading are really short. Although on Yom Kippur afternoon, I don't know about any of you, but on Yom Kippur afternoon, I definitely am feeling like Jonah is not such a short book, but it actually is quite short.
Thank you. So we have a few questions about what does it mean to be a prophet? And so I am happy to hear that your answer to that big theological question, but also in addition to that, can you talk about like what does it mean that the book of the prophets or they're closed? We're not continuing to add more prophets, and how do we think about sort of learning lessons from the prophets while not
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, before going there, I actually just want to say a couple of other things about Haftarah, and then that'll lead us into that question. I think a lot of us find it very difficult to enter into the Haftarot because we don't have context, because we've been going through the Torah, sequentially, as was said earlier. And then we get to these Haftarot, and it's like, okay, so I'm gonna read Isaiah chapter 1 last week, and this week I'm gonna read Isaiah chapter 40, which is the case this week, and then I'm gonna jump around a few other chapters for next week, and what's happening? What does it mean to be a prophet? What's going on? Why am I reading this? And prophets and prophecy is a really large question that I don't think we're going to be able to even surface level address today. But I will say that yes, it is closed. It has been closed for a very, very long time. Haggai was the last prophet. No, Malachi, excuse me. The last prophet, and that was it. Malachi, let me just kind of back up and sort of explain how the Nevi'im are structured. When I say Nevi'im means prophets in Hebrew. So we have 3 sections of Tanakh. The word Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, first 5 books, Nevi'im, prophets, Ketuvim, writings. So writings include things like the Psalms, they include things like Job, Daniel, the 5 Megillot, including Echa, which we just read. And prophets is kind of, it's interesting that we just call it the prophets, because it's actually, I would argue you could further subdivide it. You have the book of Joshua, which used to be part of the Torah, and at some point it got moved into the prophets. And then you have the book of Judges, which is the books of Joshua and Judges are talking about the early history of the Israelites once we enter the land and all of the leadership challenges. There's a lot there to learn from. And that's true to move into when we move into the books of Samuel. And actually, when we say books of Samuel, that's a bit of a misnomer because there's actually only one book of Samuel. It got divided into 2 because of printers, I believe. So we have Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, Samuel 1 and 2, but it's actually one book. And then the books of Kings, same deal, had to be divided into 2. Then we end our history there. So that's all the history of our leadership struggles and coming into the land and figuring things out. It's very rich material. I would strongly encourage anyone to go back and look at it. I think there's a lot we can learn from it. Then we get into what we call the major prophets, which is a bit of a misnomer because major and minor have nothing to do with what they prophesy. It has everything to do with how long their books are. You have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. We journey a lot liturgically with Isaiah. Isaiah is a pretty cool prophet. A lot of scholars think that Isaiah is actually divided into at least 3 sections known as first, second, and third Isaiah. That is the critical biblical view of it. And for our purposes in the Tanakh, it's considered one book, so it's the book of Isaiah. Jeremiah, prophet who is very well known for being very stern and very direct, witnessed the destruction of the first temple, was exiled. And Ezekiel, prophesying from exile. Ezekiel is a fascinating character. We're not going to go into him today, but really fascinating, distressing, complicated, involved figure. And then you have what are known as the 12 minor prophets. Now, minor is again, as I said, it's a misleading term because they're not actually minor. It's just that their books are shorter. And some of the famous people in this category are people like Amos and Jonah and Joel and Micha and Micah and Malachi, Malachi and Haggai, and there are 12 of these. And a lot of these prophets, as Abraham Joshua Heschel talks a lot about, are justice and the ways in which the people strayed from the path of righteousness and the path of uprightness. And the prophets, what does it mean to be a prophet? It means you're profoundly disliked. It means that you have a sense of divine calling. And you have a particular way of relating to the people. Like I'm thinking about Amos, for example, or I'm thinking about Isaiah. On Yom Kippur morning, we read from Isaiah, in which basically Isaiah is saying, like, I don't want your fast. Like, what's the point of you fasting today if you're not doing everything to create a more just world? Or in last week's Haftarah from Isaiah, same theme. Your Sabbaths are loathsome to me. I don't care about any of your sacrifices. Look at how terribly you treat people. None of this matters to me. I don't want your sacrifices. I want you to build a just society. And for me, when I read things like that, I actually find a lot of power in that because the understanding from the tradition is that they are the words of the prophet, right? Those are Isaiah's words, but they have divine meaning and inspiration behind them. And it's a wake-up call. A lot of prophets are giving us a real wake-up call. Sometimes, especially in Ezekiel, it can go a little too far. There definitely, I was learning the book of Ezekiel a couple of months ago, actually, and I realized I needed to pause because Ezekiel has, as is appropriate, he has very strong feelings about what the people are doing, and and he makes that very clear. And I think that's important. And I think it's something that I think we as a tradition do really well. That I think we actually could do a lot more to remind ourselves of is that we are unflinching. The prophets are unflinching, right? If you go and read a lot of this, it's like, look at the way that the people are sinning. And it's not to say, I think that there's this tendency that I really want to invite us to explore together where there's a tendency to say, people are really doing the wrong thing and therefore are essentially bad. I do not believe that is what the prophets are saying. I believe actually the prophets are saying, you are a beloved people. All people are beloved people. Now, the prophets are specifically mostly talking to the Israelites, although there are prophets who are talking to other nations. There are prophecies to other nations, but most of it is directed to us. And in those moments when most of it is directed to us, I think that at the end of the day, the prophets would say, you are deeply beloved and you are behaving in really terrible ways. Please change your ways. So the prophets are outside of the structure, right? A lot of them, some of them come from priestly connection and others do not. And they are, speaking their truth to power. They are distressing the powers that be. And I think that's ultimately what it means to be a prophet.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. We do have a hand raised from Claudette.
Please.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. My question is that I've heard it said that we read the Haftarah because it was we started to read for a time when we couldn't read Torah. We were not allowed to read Torah, so we took parts of what we were supposed to read and we read it from the Haftarah. How much of that is true?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up again. Thank you. The challenge with that's certainly what I was taught, right? That we read the Haftarah because we weren't able to read Torah because we were being persecuted by the Greeks just before the, Maccabean revolt in particular, and also with the Romans, that it was because of that persecution. Don't know how much of that is true. But I also, in saying that, want to say that whether it is exactly historically true or not, I have no doubt that there have been times in our community's history when that was true for different communities. I have no doubt about that. We unfortunately have a long history of censoring our texts because of external persecution. And though I cannot pinpoint, the historicity of is that why this started? It it would not feel out of bounds to me to say that there were lots of reasons that we did that, and that might have been one of them. I would love to hear from other folks in our last few minutes together. Does anyone have any reflections or comments? I've given you a lot. I know it's been very frontal, so.
Thank you. We have a lot of fun side chats in the chat, but it's always lovely to hear someone else's voice. So if anyone has a burning question or maybe a less burning question, it'd be great to hear from you. Okay, Diane.
Just a reflection.
Diane, are you able to unmute?
Yeah. Can you hear me? So are these attributed to actual historical individuals? When we say Isaiah, was there an Isaiah who existed? Was there a Ezekiel who existed? Or are these just names that were given to the books and the prophecies?
Love that question. My best understanding is that it is rooted in historical truth. There was a prophet Isaiah, there was a prophet Jeremiah, there was a prophet Ezekiel. Now, we don't have a ton of biography or autobiography for a lot of the prophets, but we have absolutely reason to understand that these were real people that really lived, and that there are prophets that don't have books associated with them, but also existed. So, there were actually many, many different prophets, and the ones that we have canonized are just because they have books associated with them. They wrote things down, but they are not full extent of what definitely existed that we just don't have.
Okay, great. We have 3 more hands raised. Rabbi, would
Great.
you like to take all of them or?
Yes. Yes, please. Let's take all of them.
Okay, great. So we'll start with Deborah. Okay, Deborah. Okay,
Thank
great.
you. Thank you so much, Rabbi. I am interested in hearing a little bit more. Do you think it is inherently the nature of being a prophet to be in opposition to whoever is in power? Like, how much of that is inherent and how much of that is just because, like, Jeremiah is having issues with the people who are in power?
Great. Thank you.
Great. I love that.
Go to Judith.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm curious your thoughts about how to deal with the Haftarah in congregations now, given the marginality and given, as you said, that people often, use that moment to go to the bathroom or talk to friends. What do we do to make the Haftarah meaningful again?
Love it.
And lastly, we'll go to Stephen.
Thank you. I was intrigued by your comment that you thought that the Haftarah related to the dispute with the Sumerians. So I've gone through and identified for myself in each book of the Torah what Haftarahs we have. And indeed, of all the histories and the major prophets, the book of Joshua is the only one from which we have no Haftarahs, which I find supporting and very eager. And interesting, in the book of Deuteronomy, with the exception of the last Haftarah from 2 Samuel, all the rest of them are from Isaiah.
Yes. Yep.
And,
yeah.
And you were right that the last chapter of Isaiah is the one for Rosh Chodesh.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. These are great. I'm going to take Deborah and Judith's questions, and then we will see if we have a little bit more time. Thank you, Stephen, also for your comments. And yes, it's very interesting. Actually, the only Haftarah that we read from Joshua that I am aware of, aside from Passover, we don't read any I don't believe we read anything from Joshua, as you said, during the actual Torah reading cycle, but on Simchat Torah, the Haftarah is the first chapter of Joshua, which is interesting. But I think to your point, there aren't Haftarot from Joshua during the cycle of Torah reading in general. But yeah, to Deborah's question, I do think that there is something, whether it's inherent or just strongly inclined, for a prophet to be in opposition to those in power. Because I think that, when you're in power, in lots of different ways, the prophets are, of course, talking about the state, right? The prophets are effectively in opposition to the state in a lot of ways. And when I say the state, I mean the government or the governing authority, the king, the kingship, the monarchy. And I think that there is something there because there needs to be a way to get one's dissent out into the world. And I think that is very attractive from a prophetic perspective. So yeah, I think that there's a lot there. And I think that that's really powerful. I think that there's a lot, one of the things that I think is so enduring about these prophets and the reason that they're still here and we learn from them thousands of years later, right? We have this connection, I believe can really invite us into asking about how power operates now. That the context is different, but a lot of the critique is not. And so that's something that I really want to encourage us to do, actually, is to think about, how the prophets can still really guide us. And to Judith's question, which I think is extremely important, this is again speaking for myself here. I believe it's really important to contextualize the Haftarah, to help people understand what it is we're reading, why we're reading it. We can probably all think of a million different Torah commentaries, right? Think about, this week's parasha, the Etchanan, and then the Ten Commandments is in this week's parasha, and the Shema, and the Aviyah Hafta. Like, there's a lot of good stuff in this week's parasha. I believe like a few of my other favorite psukim verses are in this week's parsha. Great. I know that I'll be able to find many commentaries on that. And sure, the Shabbat is Shabbat Nachamu, which is known for the Haftarah in Isaiah, but there aren't a ton. You can find them. There are Haftarah commentaries out there, but there aren't as many of them. And I think it would be very important to actually have more of those and to invite more contextualization, because right now it's just somebody gets up there, they chant beautifully, they work really hard on, I think about this every Saturday morning, right? They're working really hard on their chanting and it's really important. So it's very necessary, I think, for us to ground ourselves in why we're doing this at all. I think often we fall back onto habit. As a shul goer, I think about this a lot, that we really fall back on like, well, this is what we've done, so we're going to keep the form the way it is. And we're, you read the Torah, you read the Maftir, you read the Aliyah that closes the Torah reading, then you read the Haftarah and everybody kind of zonks out for 10 minutes and then move on. What a wasted opportunity, right? What would it mean if we actually said, hey, before we read the Haftarah, let's give a couple of words of context. Why are we doing this? What does this mean for us? Take this into the rest of our Shabbat and into the rest of our week. That's, I think, ultimately what the prophets are asking of us. And that's really what I would hope we will be able to do more of. And I see we are almost at time. So if there are any last closing comments, otherwise we'll move to close.
Thank you so much. Stephen has his hand raised again. Stephen, we have 3 minutes left. So I feel
okay, I'll be a short one. I'll
great.
Express it shortly. It seems to me that the standard message of the prophets is, you have sinned, whether it be idolatry or one of the others, and That's why things are so bad. Return to God and things will be good. So that it is an address more to the people of the congregation than it is to the powers that be.
Thank you for that reflection.
Thank you for that reflection.
Okay, so I hope that everyone here found this insightful, interesting, learned something. We will be following up, of course, with our sources and the recording from this session. We also will be in the next few weeks piloting a Haftarah learning series. And so the way that we look at Torah study on Friday mornings at 10:30, we are going to be looking at chapters from Isaiah on Thursday mornings at 10:30. So we will, of course, include sign up information for that in our follow-up. And we'd love to hear, would you be interested in diving more into the Haftarah and learning more about the prophets, finding ways to make this part of our Torah service more interesting, or connecting to this part of our text? So thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.